This is episode 6 of my 65-day van build. If you've not seen the prior episodes, I highly recommend checking those out before watching this one. In this episode, I'm putting up walls, installing the cubbies, failing on the ceiling, and running the Starlink data cable before installing the final version of the ceiling. For this initial wall installation, I had to rely on cardboard templates to trace out the unique shape for each wall panel. Working alone, it's a little tricky to get a panel in place and tacked so you can fasten it. To fasten each panel, I drilled countersink holes in the 1/4-inch plywood and used screws to attach it to the furring strips. It was nice to start with this first piece because it was almost a complete 4x6 sheet plywood, which covered a lot of the wall, so it was very satisfying to see it go up. It's important at this point to ensure that you've run all the electrical cables before putting up these panels. It's also good to know where they run so that in the future you don't drill into them when installing something down the road. Near the rear window, I used a router and flush trim bit to clean the edges of the wall panel, and then made a hole for an electrical cable to come through. This cable will power the reading light over the bed. Some of these wall panels are very tricky, especially when considering what cabinets will be going over them and where your electrical cables are running. So you have a lot of foresight that is required. This particular panel was actually one of the last ones I installed. As you'll see, I don't finish it here because it was quite difficult to understand how the bench in front of it would work in conjunction with this panel. Decision fatigue, I suppose. The wall panels at the rear of the van were definitely easier, even though there were some custom cuts involved. I think knowing they'd be in the garage area, not really visible, made it easier just to make the cuts and install without needing them to be perfect. Getting one whole wall nearly complete was a huge motivator as I watched the space take on a cleaner look and come closer to its final version. Installing the cubbies took a bit of mental acuity, so thankfully my buddy showed up to lend me some ideas to the process. It was wonderful to have a second set of eyes and a fresh perspective since a lot of this was just an obscure concept in my brain. We landed on attaching the cubbies to the wall panel before installing. Either way, it would have been difficult, but in this instance, it was the right choice. and made the final installation fairly straightforward. Here I'm about to start the ceiling and realizing it would be very difficult to install the ceiling slats around the air conditioner port without an additional furring strip, so I'm installing that here. However, installing those furring strips didn't do me much good. As you'll see in a moment, attempting to install the tongue and groove cedar planks fails. I couldn't get the tongue and groove to line up with the curvature of the ceiling, both laterally and longitudinally across the length of the van. So I scrapped the tongue and groove idea for the ceiling and used those planks on the bulkhead wall as an accent piece instead. There was definitely a bit of panic during this time, as I kept working and tried to figure out how I was going to finish the ceiling. The cedar planks on the bulkhead wall turned out great. I also added a little wood filler to the cubbies to clean up the gaps. I'll sand those down later. Before finishing up the walls, I had to install the data cable for the Starlink that connects the satellite dish on the roof to the modem and router inside the van. As you can see here, I had to remove one of the wall panels to feed the data cable in behind the walls to its final location. Attaching these panels with screws allows me to remove them fairly easily, which comes in handy more than you think. At this point in the build, I was getting pretty annoyed with the ceiling insulation drooping down in my way, so I was very excited to have the ceiling installed soon. But first I'm installing a piece of cherry wood along the back to cover up the exposed metal near the rear doors, mostly for aesthetics. I was very pleased to find some 1/4-inch Alder plywood at the lumber yard at a reasonable price, so I picked up a few sheets as a replacement for the unruly cedar tongue and groove strips. Similar to the walls, it was a bit of a challenge to install these larger panels by myself. However, I was able to rig up a piece of wood with an inverted clamp attached to it to hold the pieces in place while I measured and fastened them. The next trick was figuring out proper placement for the puck lights while I was also wiring them during the installation. Definitely a juggling act. Just getting that initial panel installed was a huge relief, and I was very pleased with how it looked. Each ceiling panel had its own unique way of being difficult to install. But with the insulation disappearing behind each panel, the space was looking nicer and nicer, and much more pleasant to be in. The final placement of each panel isn't exactly perfect. As I mentioned, the roof curves both laterally and longitudinally, but it was a vast improvement over the tongue and groove cedar strips. That's it for episode 6. If you've made it this far, I'll ask you to subscribe since this sort of thing seems to be your jam. Thank you for watching.